The morning sun cast long shadows across Ahmad al-Jaber Air Base in Kuwait as Major Kim Campbell walked toward her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The year was 2003, and Operation Iraqi Freedom was in full swing. Campbell had already flown dozens of combat missions over Iraq, but today felt different. The intelligence briefings had been more intense, the target coordinates more urgent, and the radio chatter between pilots carried an edge that meant serious business lay ahead. Campbell stood barely 5 feet tall, but her reputation in the cockpit towered over most of her male colleagues. She had earned her wings through relentless determination and skill that left no room for doubt. The A-10 Warthog, as pilots affectionately called their aircraft, was built for one purpose: close air support for ground troops. Its massive 30mm GAU-8 cannon could shred enemy armor, and its twin engines and reinforced cockpit could survive damage that would bring down any other aircraft. As Campbell performed her pre-flight inspection, she noticed a group of Navy SEALs gathered near the operations tent. Their commander, a weathered veteran with piercing eyes, was studying aerial photographs and pointing at specific locations on the map. The SEALs had been operating behind enemy lines for days, and their missions required air support that could get low, hit hard, and survive whatever the enemy threw back. The SEAL commander approached Campbell as she finished her inspection. His voice carried the authority of someone who had seen too much combat to waste words on pleasantries. He explained that his team needed close air support for a high-value target deep in enemy territory. The mission required flying at extremely low altitude to avoid surface-to-air missiles and radar detection. The target was a command bunker hidden in a residential area where precision strikes were essential to minimize civilian casualties. Campbell listened carefully as the SEAL commander outlined the mission parameters. The flight path would take her through a corridor of known anti-aircraft positions. Enemy fighters had been spotted in the area, and intelligence reports indicated multiple SAM sites along the route. Most concerning was the altitude requirement. The mission demanded flying at heights so low that traditional military doctrine considered it suicidal for a single-engine aircraft like the A-10. The SEAL commander's expression grew serious as he delivered the final piece of information. Previous attempts by other aircraft had failed because pilots couldn't maintain the required altitude while delivering accurate strikes. The enemy had positioned their defenses specifically to counter high-altitude bombing runs, making low-level attacks the only viable option. He looked directly at Campbell and stated flatly that his intelligence sources suggested the mission parameters were impossible for any pilot to execute successfully. Campbell felt a familiar surge of determination. Throughout her career, she had faced skeptics who doubted whether a woman could handle the physical and mental demands of combat flying. She had proven them wrong repeatedly, earning respect through performance rather than words. The A-10 was her weapon of choice because it rewarded aggressive flying and precise shooting. Unlike sleek fighters that relied on speed and altitude, the Warthog demanded pilots who could think fast, fly low, and fight dirty. The briefing room filled with tension as other pilots gathered for the mission overview. Maps covered every available surface, marked with threat zones, friendly positions, and escape routes. The intelligence officer pointed out known SAM sites, anti-aircraft artillery positions, and enemy fighter patrol patterns. The target itself presented unique challenges. A hardened bunker surrounded by civilian buildings that required surgical precision to avoid collateral damage. Campbell studied the mission profile with growing excitement rather than apprehension. The required flight path would take her through valleys and urban areas at altitudes that would make her aircraft vulnerable to small arms fire. Enemy forces would have multiple opportunities to engage her with everything from rifles to rocket-propelled grenades. The margin for error was essentially zero, and any mechanical failure would likely prove fatal. As the briefing continued, Campbell began formulating her approach. The A-10's design gave her certain advantages that other aircraft lacked. Its twin engines provided redundancy if one was damaged. The cockpit's titanium bathtub could stop small arms fire and shell fragments. Most importantly, the aircraft's slow-speed handling characteristics allowed for precise maneuvering in tight spaces where faster jets would be uncontrollable. The SEAL commander pulled Campbell aside after the main briefing. He explained that ground forces were in immediate danger and needed air support within hours. Traditional strike aircraft had already attempted the mission twice without success. High-altitude bombing runs had proven ineffective against the hardened target. and the enemy had adapted their defensive positions to counter conventional attack profiles. The SEALs needed someone willing to take risks that most pilots would consider reckless. Campbell's response was immediate and unequivocal. She would fly the mission exactly as specified, regardless of the altitude requirements or threat levels. Her confidence wasn't based on bravado but on intimate knowledge of her aircraft's capabilities and her own skills as a pilot. The A-10 had been designed to operate in exactly these conditions, and she had trained extensively for low-altitude combat scenarios. Preparation for the mission required careful calculation of fuel loads, ammunition selection, and flight timing. Campbell would carry a full load of 30mm rounds for the GAU-8 cannon, along with Maverick missiles for precision strikes against hardened targets. Every pound of weight affected the aircraft's performance at low altitude, so she eliminated all non-essential equipment to maximize maneuverability and range. The weather forecast added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous mission. Cloud cover would provide concealment from enemy observation posts but also limit visibility for target acquisition. Wind patterns at low altitude could affect weapon accuracy and make flying more challenging in confined spaces. Campbell studied meteorological data carefully, looking for windows of opportunity when conditions would favor her approach. Fellow pilots offered advice and encouragement, but their expressions revealed underlying concern about the mission parameters. Several had flown similar aircraft in combat and understood the risks involved in low-altitude operations. The consensus among experienced pilots was that the mission pushed beyond acceptable risk levels, even for combat operations. Campbell appreciated their concern but remained focused on mission success rather than survival odds. The final briefing session covered emergency procedures and extraction protocols in case the mission went wrong. Search and rescue assets would be positioned along the flight route, but their ability to reach Campbell quickly in enemy territory was limited. She would be flying alone, beyond the range of friendly fighter escort, relying entirely on her aircraft's defensive systems and her own piloting skills to survive. As Campbell walked toward her aircraft for the final pre-flight inspection, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Every training flight, every combat mission, and every challenge overcome had prepared her for exactly this type of operation. The A-10 represented more than just an aircraft. It was a tool that allowed skilled pilots to make impossible missions possible through determination and precise execution. The aircraft maintenance crew had worked through the night to ensure every system functioned perfectly. They understood that their pilot would be pushing the A-10 to its operational limits, and any mechanical failure could prove fatal. Each technician took personal responsibility for their specific systems, knowing that Campbell's life depended on their expertise and attention to detail. Campbell strapped into her ejection seat and began the startup sequence. The familiar sounds and vibrations of the twin turbofan engines provided comfort and confidence. Every switch, gauge, and control surface responded exactly as expected. The A-10 was ready for combat, and so was its pilot. The mission that Navy SEALs had declared impossible was about to become another chapter in the legend of the Warthog and the pilots who flew them into harm's way. Campbell's A-10 lifted off from Ahmad al-Jaber Air Base at precisely 0800 hours, climbing steadily into the clear morning sky over Kuwait. The aircraft felt solid and responsive beneath her hands as she ran through post-takeoff checks. Every system showed green, and the twin General Electric turbofan engines hummed with reassuring power. Behind her, the familiar landscape of friendly territory stretched to the horizon, but ahead lay the dangerous airspace of southern Iraq, where enemy forces waited. The flight plan called for a circuitous route that would avoid known SAM sites and fighter patrol areas. Campbell would approach the target from an unexpected direction, using terrain masking to remain undetected until the final attack run. The route added 30 minutes to the mission time, but significantly improved her chances of reaching the target undetected. Every mile of Iraqi territory brought new threats, and survival depended on staying invisible to enemy radar and observation posts. As Campbell crossed into Iraqi airspace, she began her descent toward the deck. The A-10's altitude dropped steadily from 15,000 feet to 5,000 feet. Then lower still, at 500 feet above ground level, she was flying well below normal safety margins, but the mission required even more extreme altitude parameters. The landscape rushed past her canopy at 300 knots. A blur of desert, buildings, and roads that demanded constant attention to avoid obstacles. Radio chatter from the forward air controller painted a grim picture of the tactical situation. Enemy forces had detected friendly ground movements and were mobilizing defensive positions around the target area. Anti-aircraft artillery units had moved into firing positions overnight, creating additional threats that weren't present during mission planning. The window for successful attack was closing rapidly as enemy commanders reinforced their defensive perimeter. Campbell acknowledged the updated intelligence while maintaining her focus on low-level navigation. Flying at extreme low altitude required split-second reactions to avoid power lines, radio towers, and other obstacles that could destroy her aircraft instantly. The A-10's design helped manage these risks with excellent forward visibility and responsive controls, but ultimate responsibility lay with the pilot's skill and reaction time. The first indication of enemy contact came through her radar warning receiver. Surface-to-air missile sites had detected her presence and were attempting to establish targeting locks. Campbell immediately began evasive maneuvers, using the terrain to break radar contact while maintaining course toward the target. The A-10's low radar cross-section and ground-hugging flight profile made her difficult to track. But staying invisible required constant vigilance. Approaching the target area, Campbell spotted the hardened bunker that intelligence had identified as the high-value objective. The structure was partially concealed beneath camouflage netting and surrounded by secondary buildings that complicated the attack geometry. Civilian structures nearby demanded precise weapon placement to avoid collateral damage. The target presented a perfect example of why the mission required low-altitude precision rather than high-altitude bombing. Campbell lined up for her initial attack run while scanning for defensive positions. Enemy soldiers were visible around the bunker complex, some manning anti-aircraft weapons that posed immediate threats to her aircraft. Small arms fire began tracking her movement as alert defenders realized that an American warplane was approaching at extremely low altitude. Green tracers streaked past her canopy, close enough to see individual bullets. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon roared to life as Campbell squeezed the trigger. The massive 30mm rounds tore through enemy positions with devastating effect, silencing several anti-aircraft guns before they could establish effective fire. The distinctive sound of the cannon's 7 rotating barrels created a deep, throaty growl that enemy forces had learned to fear. Each burst sent dozens of depleted uranium rounds downrange at 3,900 rounds per minute. Enemy return fire intensified dramatically as Campbell's presence became impossible to ignore. Anti-aircraft artillery opened up from concealed positions, filling the sky with explosive shells designed to destroy low-flying aircraft. Campbell threw the A-10 into violent, evasive maneuvers, pulling heavy G-forces while maintaining enough control to keep the target in sight. The aircraft's reinforced structure handled the stress, but the pilot felt every acceleration pressing against her body. The bunker itself required direct hits from Maverick missiles to penetrate its reinforced construction. Campbell launched her first missile from minimum range, watching the weapon track straight toward its target. The explosion sent debris flying in all directions, but initial damage assessment suggested the structure remained partially intact. A second missile would be necessary to complete the destruction, requiring another attack run through the increasingly dangerous defensive fire. Banking hard to avoid a surface-to-air missile that had been launched from a nearby position, Campbell felt the A-10 shudder as something struck the aircraft. Warning lights illuminated on her instrument panel, indicating damage to hydraulic systems. The aircraft remained controllable, but handling characteristics had changed noticeably. Combat damage was always a possibility in close air support missions, but dealing with it while under heavy fire tested every aspect of her training. Campbell's second attack run took her even lower, barely 50 feet above the buildings surrounding the target. At this altitude, small arms fire became as dangerous as heavy anti-aircraft weapons. Enemy soldiers with rifles and machine guns had clear shots at her aircraft as she screamed overhead. The A-10's titanium armor absorbed most hits, but critical systems remained vulnerable to lucky shots or concentrated fire. The second Maverick missile struck the bunker dead center, creating a massive explosion that collapsed the entire structure. Secondary explosions indicated that ammunition or fuel supplies had been ignited, confirming destruction of the target. Campbell's mission was successful, but her aircraft had taken significant damage during the attack runs. Multiple warning lights indicated hydraulic failures, engine problems, and flight control damage that would make the return flight extremely challenging. Enemy fighters had been scrambled to intercept Campbell's aircraft, adding a new dimension to her survival challenges. 2 MiG 23 seconds were approaching from the north, armed with air-to-air missiles and determined to prevent her escape. The A-10 was no match for fighters in air-to-air combat, lacking the speed and maneuverability necessary for dogfighting. Campbell's only advantages were her low altitude and the superior low-speed handling of her aircraft. Ground fire continued to track Campbell's movement as she departed the target area. A particularly accurate burst from an anti-aircraft gun scored multiple hits on her aircraft, causing additional damage to already compromised systems. The A-10 began flying differently, requiring constant control inputs to maintain level flight. Something was seriously wrong with the primary flight controls, but diagnostic systems were too damaged to provide clear information about the extent of the problems. The approaching fighters forced Campbell to remain at extremely low altitude, where their radar systems had difficulty maintaining lock-on. Flying barely above rooftop level through urban areas, she used buildings and terrain to mask her escape route. The fighters' high-speed characteristics worked against them in this environment, preventing them from matching her flight profile without risking ground impact. Campbell's fuel situation was becoming critical as damaged systems increased consumption rates beyond normal parameters. The return flight to friendly territory would push her reserves to absolute limits, assuming no further combat engagements or mechanical failures. Every decision now involved calculating whether her remaining fuel and damaged aircraft could complete specific maneuvers or course changes. Radio contact with friendly forces provided updates on search and rescue preparations in case Campbell was forced to eject over enemy territory. Multiple assets were being positioned along her projected flight path, but their ability to reach her quickly in hostile territory remained questionable. The best strategy was reaching friendly airspace before catastrophic system failures made continued flight impossible. The damage to Campbell's aircraft was becoming more apparent as she fought to maintain control. Hydraulic failures had eliminated power assistance for primary flight controls, requiring significant physical strength to move control surfaces. The A-10's manual reversion capability allowed continued flight even with total hydraulic failure, but piloting became exhausting work that would eventually overcome human endurance. Enemy ground fire continued sporadically as Campbell's flight path took her over remaining defensive positions. Her extremely low altitude made targeting difficult for most weapon systems, but also eliminated any margin for error in aircraft control. A momentary loss of concentration or control could result in ground impact at speeds that would ensure instant death. The approaching border with friendly territory represented safety and survival, but reaching it required flying another 100 miles through potentially hostile airspace with a severely damaged aircraft. Campbell's determination and skill would be tested to their absolute limits during the journey home. Every mile covered brought her closer to safety, but also increased the risk of catastrophic mechanical failure that could end the mission in disaster. Campbell's crippled A-10 limped through Iraqi airspace with multiple systems failing and enemy fighters still hunting for her. The aircraft's handling had deteriorated significantly since the target area, requiring constant pressure on the controls to maintain level flight. Warning lights painted her instrument panel red, indicating problems with hydraulics, flight controls, and engine systems that would normally require immediate landing at the nearest airfield. 20 miles from the target area, Campbell discovered the true extent of her aircraft's damage. A large-caliber anti-aircraft round had severed the main hydraulic lines running through the A-10's tail section. Without hydraulic pressure, the primary flight controls became extremely heavy and unresponsive. Moving the stick required both hands and significant physical effort, making precise maneuvering nearly impossible. The A-10's designers had anticipated exactly this scenario. Unlike most military aircraft, the Warthog included a manual reversion system that allowed pilots to maintain control even with complete hydraulic failure. Steel cables connected the cockpit controls directly to the control surfaces, bypassing all hydraulic systems. The manual backup system had saved many A-10 pilots over the years, but flying with manual reversion was exhausting work that tested human endurance limits. Campbell quickly adapted her flying technique to accommodate the damaged controls. Instead of making small, frequent adjustments, she planned ahead and made deliberate control inputs that would keep the aircraft stable for longer periods. The A-10's inherent stability helped manage the workload, but maintaining altitude and heading still required constant attention and physical effort. The pursuing MiG-23 fighters had lost visual contact when Campbell ducked into a river valley, but they continued searching the area with determination. Their pilots knew that a damaged American aircraft would be flying slowly and predictably, making it an easy target if located. Campbell used every fold in the terrain to remain hidden while nursing her crippled aircraft toward the border. Fuel consumption had increased dramatically due to the damaged engine and the extra power required to maintain flight with manual controls. Campbell calculated her remaining range carefully, realizing that reaching friendly territory would consume nearly every drop of usable fuel. Any significant detours or delays would leave her with insufficient fuel to complete the mission, forcing ejection over enemy territory. Radio communications with friendly forces revealed that search and rescue assets were moving into position along the border. Combat search and rescue helicopters had launched from bases in Kuwait, but their response time to Campbell's location would be measured in hours rather than minutes. If she went down in enemy territory, survival would depend on evading capture until rescue forces could reach her position. The manual flight controls demanded Campbell's complete attention, leaving little capacity for navigation or threat assessment. She relied heavily on her GPS system and pre-planned waypoints to stay on course, while focusing primarily on keeping the aircraft airborne. The A-10's rugged construction was proving its worth, absorbing battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. 30 miles from the border, Campbell encountered a new threat that intelligence briefings had not anticipated. A mobile SAM unit had positioned itself directly along her planned escape route, apparently moved there specifically to intercept damaged American aircraft returning from missions over Iraq. The missile battery was well positioned to engage targets at the low altitudes that Campbell was forced to maintain. The surface-to-air missile launch was unmistakable, a bright column of flame and smoke rising rapidly from the desert floor. Campbell had perhaps 15 seconds before the missile would reach her altitude and explode with enough force to destroy any aircraft within its lethal radius. With damaged controls and limited maneuverability, conventional evasive tactics would be impossible to execute effectively. Campbell's response demonstrated the aggressive flying style that had made her reputation. Instead of turning away from the missile, she turned toward it and dove even lower, using the Earth's curvature to break the weapon's guidance system. The missile, designed to intercept aircraft at normal combat altitudes, lost its target lock when Campbell's A-10 dropped below its minimum engagement envelope. The SAM site attempted to engage with anti-aircraft artillery as Campbell's aircraft passed nearby. Heavy-caliber shells burst around her. A-10, sending fragments through the air that could cause additional damage to already compromised systems. Campbell felt the aircraft shudder as more metal found its mark, but the tough Warthog continued flying despite accumulating battle damage that would have downed most other aircraft. Ground fire from the SAM site scored several hits on Campbell's aircraft, including at least one round that struck near the cockpit area. The titanium armor bath that surrounded the pilot deflected the most serious threats, but secondary damage affected additional systems already operating at reduced capacity. Warning lights that had been intermittent became steady, indicating permanent system failures rather than temporary malfunctions. Campbell's physical condition was becoming a limiting factor in the mission's success. Flying with manual reversion required continuous heavy pressure on the controls, using muscle groups not typically stressed during normal flight operations. Her arms and shoulders ached from the constant effort, and fatigue was beginning to affect her precision and reaction time. The border with Kuwait appeared on Campbell's navigation display as a thin green line still 25 miles away. Friendly territory meant safety, medical attention, and maintenance support that could properly assess and repair her aircraft's damage. Reaching that line required maintaining control of increasingly unreliable aircraft systems while avoiding any additional enemy contact that could overwhelm her remaining capabilities. Campbell's fuel quantity indicators showed reserves dropping toward emergency levels. The damaged engine was consuming fuel at rates well beyond normal parameters, and the extra power required for manual flight controls further increased consumption. Mathematical calculations suggested she had barely enough fuel remaining to reach the border, assuming no further complications or course deviations. Radio contact with approaching rescue helicopters provided moral support and coordination for potential emergency procedures. The combat search and rescue crews were experienced in recovering pilots from hostile territory but their operations required precise timing and location information. Campbell's primary responsibility remained getting her aircraft to friendly airspace before mechanical failures made continued flight impossible. 15 miles from safety, Campbell's left engine began showing signs of serious mechanical problems. Oil pressure was dropping steadily, and exhaust gas temperatures were climbing beyond normal operating limits. The engine was gradually destroying itself from internal damage caused by enemy fire. But it needed to function for just a few more minutes to complete the escape. Campbell reduced power on the failing engine while increasing power on the right engine to compensate. The asymmetric thrust made controlling the aircraft even more difficult with manual reversion, requiring constant rudder pressure to maintain heading. The A-10's design allowed single-engine flight, but added complexity to an already challenging situation. The Kuwaiti border finally appeared ahead as a line of friendly checkpoints and defensive positions. Campbell's aircraft crossed into safe airspace with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining and multiple systems in various stages of failure. The left engine was smoking heavily and would likely fail completely within minutes, but the mission had been accomplished successfully. Campbell's approach to Ahmad al-Jaber Air Base attracted considerable attention from ground personnel, who could see the extensive battle damage covering her aircraft. Holes from anti-aircraft fire were visible throughout the fuselage and wings, with particular concentration around the tail section, where hydraulic lines had been severed. The fact that the A-10 was still flying demonstrated both the aircraft's legendary toughness and the pilot's exceptional skill. The landing was accomplished with manual controls and single-engine power, requiring precise timing and energy management that left no margin for error. Campbell touched down smoothly despite the aircraft's damaged condition, rolling out on the runway with emergency vehicles following closely behind. The mission that Navy SEALs had declared impossible had been completed successfully, proving once again that determined pilots in well-designed aircraft could accomplish extraordinary feats. Post-flight inspection revealed over 200 holes in Campbell's aircraft from various types of enemy fire. The hydraulic system was completely destroyed. Multiple control cables had been damaged, and one engine was beyond repair. Despite this extensive damage, the A-10's redundant systems and armored construction had protected the pilot and allowed mission completion. Campbell's aggressive flying and precise weapon delivery had eliminated a high-value target while surviving conditions that would have destroyed most other aircraft. The mission's success validated both the A-10's design philosophy and the training programs that produced pilots capable of such extraordinary performance under combat conditions. Campbell's achievement became legendary among close air support pilots, demonstrating that impossible missions could become possible through skill, determination, and aircraft designed specifically for surviving in hostile environments. The Navy SEALs who had doubted the mission's feasibility gained new respect for A-10 pilots and the unique capabilities of their unglamorous but incredibly effective aircraft.